Today we will be discussing the revolution for the youth in the 1960s, a journey with lots of ups and downs. Let's get right into it.
We will be discussing College Board's A-Push course and exam description effective fall 2019 and its key concepts for the topic youth culture of the 1960s. The 1960s featured multiple influential and popular figures alongside rather memorable quotes of which characterize the century and demonstrate the ideas of pacifism, rejection of traditionalism, and the improvement of rights for minorities. Please feel free to pause the video to read quotes from songwriter and peace activist John Lennon, civil rights activist Jerry Rubin, and feminist Betty Friedan.
The 1960s brought about a train of progress through a counterculture full of twists and turns of behavior and protest, contradicting that of the social norms and tradition that seemed the most proper and correct to follow blindly before. This change in thought and questioning of customs led to a wave of civil rights movements all over the US, and even branched out as youth looked to try to fix and advocate for the injustices they believed were in foreign affairs with events such as the Vietnam War. At the core of the counterculture was television. Following this are US foreign policy, multiple rights movements, the breaking of social norms, and a cultural revolution. We'll be diving into more of these in detail throughout the presentation. Hold on tight. Television was perhaps at the center of society as it covered important recent news, showed protests and movements, and ultimately was able to change how America viewed itself. Thanks to the TV, Americans were able to become better informed on the inequalities and issues plaguing the US, and even form their own opinions on the morality of current events. An example of these protests shown on the television are as followed.
But when we turn to already developed parts of the world, we find young people showing acute dissatisfaction with what's been achieved in the world they live in.
To begin with, Key Concept 8.1 reveals the increase of anti-war protests in response to the Vietnam War. Compared to previous years, we saw with the Red Scares and the initiation of the Cold War that America was passionate about their anti-communist foreign policy. However, among Americans, specifically among the youth, many were resistant to participate and support a fight that wasn't theirs, and even sought to resort to violence to express this resistance.
Before the 1960s, policies during the Cold War and increasing fears of radical ideas and immigrants made it clear that the US was set on containing communism, the Soviet Union, and totalitarianism. Examples of these include the Hollywood blacklist that denied jobs to supposedly communist sympathizers, the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, two Soviet spies giving away top-secret information for things such as radar, sonar, and nuclear weapon designs, and the House of Un-American Activities Committee, investigating anyone that's seen to have fascist or communist ties. Here is a timeline of some examples by which opposition took place against the Vietnam War, and debates over governmental development of war technologies and complexes. Feel free to pause, but don't get too overwhelmed. Let's better understand these events through political cartoons and descriptions.
Despite previous years of attempts to contain communism, U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War led to widespread anti-war protests and debate between war hawks and doves, especially as the government was failing to be transparent about the truth of their intentions and of events such as the My Lai massacre, in which American soldiers brutally killed innocent, unarmed Vietnamese women, children, and men. This loss in sense of purpose was only furthered by the Pentagon Papers that revealed concealed errors made by John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. As a result, the credibility gap would only come to grow, along with the distrust of the U.S. government by American peoples. This would be furthered even more with the National Guard firing at peaceful anti-war protesters at Kent State University and Jackson State College. In fact, Key Concept 8.2 continues this idea of tension between American peoples and the government, as there was much debate over political policies, especially from the left, which demanded even more domestic change and argued against some American intervention abroad.
With the 1960s, liberalism focusing on the protection of individual freedom highly increased in response to anti-communism, and many demanded change from the government. The above is the definition of liberalism. The timeline is the liberalism manifestation in American culture. No worries, we'll discuss some of them throughout the presentation. With the strengthening of the New Left and liberalists, we saw increased protests and movements toward increased rights of the people through the youth, with protests by students for a democratic society, USB, Columbia University, etc. In all of these, we saw massive gatherings of youth that advocated for peace and even began normalizing the unusual, such as with Woodstock in 1969, which was a music festival where crowd broke social norms such as open drug use, labelless love, and rock music. In addition, for the UCB event, it was one of the first big protests that took place at the University of California at Berkeley in 1964. This protest was rather clean-cut. Later ones will be involved with the experimentation of psychedelic drugs and other forms of defiance from the youth.
Under President Lyndon Johnson between 1963 and 1969, the United States saw the enactment of liberal policies in the government through a series of acts and Supreme Court cases under the Warren Court that sought to continue the New Deal with improvements in education, specifically with Project Head Start, which funded students rather than schools, medical care with Medicaid for the elderly and Medicare for the impoverished, immigration reform, and voting rights, specifically for African Americans. In the 1960s, as a result of the anxiety over the Cold War, uprose the political and moral division in the nation, resulting in widespread events and policies such as Vietnam War teach-ins, in which teachers use class time to reaffirm opposition to the war, and the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18. In this division took root the development of mass culture, which stood to further challenge conformity and bring about the famous beat movement, rock and roll music, pop art, and the hippies of the counterculture.
In continuation of the political division, conservatives challenged many of Lyndon Johnson's liberal policies and Warren Supreme Court decisions. They sought to limit the control of the federal government and increase foreign involvement. Resistance to the policies were also seen with the presidency of Richard Nixon, although Nixon would actually expand the Great Society, and Barry Goldwater's presidential administration and platform against liberal policies such as the Great Society. Meanwhile, some liberals also rejected these policies as they felt the U.S. was failing to domestically reform racial and economic status quo with their pursuit of foreign affairs. For example, the Black Panther Party 1966, an organization of armed black militants, expressed their growing dissatisfaction with the nonviolent wing of the civil rights movement with their peaceful protests. Next, Yippies, the Youth International Party, an anarchist group that opposed the Vietnam War and conformity. Finally, there was also draft evasions during the Vietnam War.
From Key Concept 8.3, it is revealed that there was the more vocal fight for equality from a wide range of marginalized groups and minorities. Among these were African Americans, the LGBTQ community, women, and other less prominent but equally important minorities. These domestic wars were largely fought by many of the youth who had already begun the rejection of the traditional values of previous generations.
There were many ways in which the youth rejected traditions with counterculture, particularly with the sexual revolution. With this movement, there was a normalization of sex with the first ever birth control pill authorized by the FDA in 1960. In addition to this, there was also the book Master and Johnson's Human Sexual Intercourse in 1966 to educate others on sex, and communes, in which others thought were sinks of drug-ridden sexual immorality, but many youth flocked over to experiment and find themselves.
Following Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and the peaceful protests of his time against racial discrimination, such as with Freedom Rides, the Selma March, and Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins, the 1960s saw many reforms with the government in response. Among these measures were the desegregation of the armed services, Brown v. Board of Education, which ruled racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended public racial segregation and employment racial discrimination. Even so, there was still much resistance that slowed this fight for equality, and thus the civil rights movement, especially the call of the youth, began a debate over the use of nonviolence, turning over to more aggressive tactics under Malcolm X with events such as the Watts Riot, intended to end residential segregation and racial discrimination from the police.
During this time, the question of women and the LGBTQ community's rights came into question, and many activists began to mobilize for equality. With women, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963, sparked the modern feminist movement by exposing the woman's perspective of lack of satisfaction to be confined to the household. The movement saw the creation of the National Organization for Women of 1966, as they called for equal employment opportunity and equal pay for women and the passing of the Equal Pay Act of 1963 that prohibited discrimination based on gender in wages and benefits. With the LGBTQ+ community, the movement saw its most important fight in gay liberation movement with the Stonewall Riots of 1969, which were spontaneous, violent demonstrations by members of the gay community against the police raid.
In addition to these movements, there were many other demands to address past injustices upon minorities in the U.S., including Latino, American Indian, and Asian American. With the American Indian movement, many Native Americans worked towards the preservation of their culture, brought attention to U.S. violation of past treaties regarding tribal land, and initiated activism with movements and protests such as when the Indians of all tribes occupied an abandoned prison in Alcatraz, and protest against U.S. mistreatment of Native Americans. With the Latino community, one of the major issues was labor justice, along with citizenship, education, and so forth. But with the United Farm Workers led by Cesar Chavez, the era would see the most success with labor rights for Latinos, largely through the peaceful protests with the Delano grape strikes. Finally, Asian Americans would see union with organizations such as the Asian American Political Alliance, which fought for liberation for Asian Americans and supported many other minority movements of the time.
Thanks for watching, and we hope you learned something new.